All right, today we are going to read chapter 7 and 8 of Romans. We will get to halfway through the book. That'll get us halfway through the book when we get this done. And we will finish this particular part of Romans where he is talking about the nature of being dead to sin. We have made the case, we have gone from our progression of making the case that all human beings are under sin alike, Jews, Gentiles, slave, anywhere in the world, any time in history, whether you were the first man who ever lived, or you lived at any point between him and the giving of the law at Sinai to Moses and the Hebrews. If you lived any time during that time, you were subject to the law of sin and death, even if there wasn't a written law for you to follow at that point. You still had the law of conscience implanted in you by virtue of being made in the image of God and having the ability to know and discern that there was a God that made all this, whose standards we were asked to follow. Whether you were a Hebrew who lived from the time of Moses to the time of Christ and you were under the law, you were a member of the covenant family that was given the law at a point after, of course, the covenant was made, or whether you were outside the covenant family during that time, or now in the present tense after the making of the new covenant through Jesus' act of mercy on the cross. Whatever it is, whenever you came around, wherever you lived, at any point in history, from beginning to end, you're under sin. No one can look in the mirror or look God in the face, or even look themselves, honestly, and say, I've never made a single mistake. Again, I go back to the school test analogy. No one can say, I've been graded on my performance in life every minute of every day, and I've never gotten a single question wrong. No one can say that. No one has ever been able to say that. But there were certain advantages that came, legitimate advantages that came with being a Jew. Now, these advantages did not guarantee them salvation, and they put too much stock in these advantages, assuming that they had salvation through them, and that wasn't the case. And this promise to Abraham, as he said in Galatians, was never meant to be just about the literal seeds that came from his literal loins. It was always intended to be broader than that. It was referring to the blessing that Jesus would bring on the whole human race eventually. Then he got into the Adam, went back to the Adam, the first man who sinned, and then the second Adam who did not sin, and made it possible for human beings to share in his righteousness after we have shared in the first man's sin and rebellion. And then he said, and then that goes on to the question of, shall we keep on sinning to make God look even better? The more that we sin, the more grace God gives us. Doesn't that mean we should just keep on sinning so we can keep getting more grace? And he talked about how ridiculous an argument that was and how we put the old man to death. Like, that's done. That way of life, that way of thinking is over. We can't continue doing that. We can't continue living that way. We are no. So he used in chapter 6, he used two different kinds of images: death and life, and slavery, and to whom you're going to be a slave. You put the old man to death. When you went down into the waters of your baptism, the old man went down, and he didn't come back up again. When you came up out of the waters of baptism, you were a new creation. You were born again, or born from above, as Jesus mentioned to Nicodemus in the conversation recorded in John chapter 3. You were your body was made of the same physical matter, but you were a new creation. Your old self stayed down there. It was put to death, and it stayed down there. Your new self came up out of that water. He also used the imagery of slavery. And you're not going to be free no matter what. So get that thought out of your heads right now. And that's painful. That's tough. We want to believe we don't. Part of that's just simple human nature. Okay, we want to believe we can be our own masters. Well, that's always been the case. Cain wanted to believe he was his own master. I mentioned him last time, even after he killed Abel and he was condemned for that, he was told to go wander, and instead he tried to build a city. He wanted to be his own master even in the midst of his punishment after murdering his brother. Human beings have always wanted to be their own masters. We today have a particular revulsion to slavery because we think of slavery in a U.S. context in the 16, 17, and 1800s. And we've been so conditioned. And that is true. That, I'm not saying that was terrible. But the slavery that Paul is talking about in his day, first of all, it wasn't, you were still a slave. But secondly, it was also a different kind of slavery. The mechanics of how slavery worked in Paul's day were different than how the U.S. and the little colonies and in the U.S. justified slavery up through the middle of the 1800s. But we look at it from that prism because that's our own history. And it can be difficult sometimes to put ourselves back in the mindset of someone who lived 1,800 years before the U.S. Civil War and how he saw slavery. And how, a third of the population at that time would have been slaves. And his point is that you're not going to be free no matter what. There is no such thing, really, as a free human being. You're going to be a slave to something. You were slaves to sin. Now you're slaves to righteousness. So it just doesn't make any sense to continue following the old nature, your old master of sin. You're done with that. If you weren't done with that, then you shouldn't have gotten baptized, because that was the whole point of your baptism and your entry into this new family of believers that have been called to be God's children and God's family, is that you've got a new master now. You're a slave to righteousness. You're indwelt by the Holy Spirit to empower you to live for righteousness. So it's kind of silly to talk about going on sinning so that God can continue giving us more grace. Like that doesn't even make sense. So now in the next two chapters, 7 and 8, he is going to continue developing this theme of living according to the old nature or according to the new nature, and how today, as baptized Christians, we live by the new nature, and we put to death the sinful desires of the old nature. So this is still kind of all coming from the discussion that he started at the end of chapter 6 about, remember, throughout this letter, Paul is anticipating objections that someone in the audience is going to say, and he anticipates these moments where he expects someone to say something, so then he says it. Okay, he says that, and then he offers his rebuttal to that. Remember, he's not actually going to talk to these people. He will get to Rome eventually. He's planning on getting there. He's in Corinth, or somewhere around Corinth right now. And he was planning on going to Rome after going to Jerusalem. And he will end up doing that. That is what's going to happen, although it's going to take 3 years longer than he expects. And it'll be done, and he will get to Rome under very different circumstances than he's anticipating. But he will eventually get there. But he's not going to be there at least for a while, even in his own mind. In the best case scenario, he's not going to be there for a few months at least. So he's not going to be there to actually teach this stuff to them himself. So he's sending this letter to them, and he is going through his sermon from start to finish, from Romans 1 to the end. And as he reaches certain points, he is expecting certain objections from the audience. So he raises these objections and then responds to them as part of his delivery style. And he did that at the beginning of chapter 6. He had just got done talking about the difference between the old Adam, the original human, and the new Adam, Jesus, and how we take after the old Adam and our sinful nature, and after we become baptized, we take after Jesus and the new Adam. And again, this is basically what Jesus was telling Nicodemus about in John chapter 3. You can go there and read that. In fact, the entire book of John is basically about this. The entire book of John contrasts the man from heaven versus a man from below us, and Jesus' way of speaking about the Spirit and all that dovetails very nicely with what Paul is saying here in Romans. So he's making this contrast between the old Adam and the new Adam. The old Adam and he knows that someone is going to say, well, we could just keep on sinning then, and so God can keep giving us grace. That just makes God look even better when he keeps forgiving us for all the sins we commit. And so he's saying that's a silly argument. That part of you is dead. You've put that part of your nature to death. You have a new master now, a slave to righteousness. And so he's going to continue contrasting these two things here in chapter 7 and chapter 8. In chapter 7, he's going to be talking about the old Adam, the old nature, and its desires and its wants. Remember, going back to James, we read in James how the process of sin works. Okay, everybody is led off when they're enticed by something they desire, and then that desire leads to sin, and sin leads to death. So that is what we're going to be contrasting here, is where these desires come from. Romans chapter 7. I say all this because Romans 7 is kind of a weird chapter, and it can be kind of tricky to follow. So we have to set the table for what we're about to talk about here. Romans chapter 7. Do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to men who know the law, that the law has authority over a man only as long as he lives? Now, when he says, I am speaking to men who know the law, it sounds, I'm assuming he's talking about Jewish men who know the law, like the law of Moses, because there would have been some Jews in this congregation of Roman Christians and Christians in Rome. He could be referring to just the civil law of the land as well, which everybody would have known about, even Gentile Christians, I'm not sure. The principle here would probably apply in either case, because he's talking about a matter of civil law. So that the law has authority over a man only as long as he lives. For example, by law, a married woman, is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. So then, if she marries another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from that law and is not an adulteress, even if she marries another man. So, my brothers, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit to God. So, he's now gone on to a third image. He had been talking about death to life in chapter 6. Then he started talking about slavery to sin or slavery to righteousness in the second half of chapter 6. Now he's talking about marriage. You were married to an old master, but you've died and you've been set free from that marriage relationship. And now you're married to a new master. When you went into again, this all goes back to baptism. Baptism here is viewed as a two-part process. Part of it involves the old self dying. The old self that was part of the old Adam, which we read about in chapter 5, that served its own carnal, corrupt desires, that comes from the ground that was cursed way back in Genesis 3. That old self is dead, follows in the pattern of rebellion of the first man in Genesis 2, Genesis 3. That old self has died. That's been put to death. The creature that came up out of the water is new. It's in the image of the new Adam. It's born of spirit, as Jesus says again in John 3. It's a slave to righteousness, and it's married to a new husband. For when we were controlled by the sinful nature, and here it says, or the flesh, our carnal desires that come from our rebellion in the old Adam, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. This is basically what we saw happen in the garden when they fell to the temptation to eat the fruit of the tree. God told them not to eat of that fruit, and then they heard this, heard the serpent kind of question whether or not that was really a good command. So they looked there at that tree and said, "Oh, you know what? I want to eat that fruit." Like the specific, and we know this today. This is just how human nature is. You tell someone not to do something, especially a kid, and that just makes them more likely to want to do it. You tell a kid not to do something, and lo and behold, you just increase the chances that that kid is going to do that very thing you just told them not to do. That's just how, for whatever the reason, that's just how human nature works. But so, when the law told us not to do things, somehow or another, that stirred up in us a desire to do those very things. When we knew it was forbidden, when we knew it was something we shouldn't do, we suddenly began to desire to do it even more. For when we were controlled by the sinful nature, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what once bound us, now again, let's go back, let's actually talk about this fruit thing. The easiest way that we can compare the different kinds of fruit, of course, is to go to Galatians. Now, we've read Galatians before, but let's read it again. Galatians 5, starting in verse 16. So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of sinful nature. It's essentially the same thing he's saying here in Romans 7. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit desires what is contrary to the sinful nature. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. That's essentially a summary of what he's going to say here in Romans 7. The acts of the sinful nature are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. That's essentially a simpler explanation of what he's about to say here in Romans 7. But now, by dying to what once bound us, this old nature, this old master, this old ruler, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. We don't have to keep answering every question on every test completely perfectly from now until the end of our lives. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? So is he saying now is the law a bad thing? Because the law produced in us all these bad desires, is the law bad? Certainly not. This is a very easy thing to get mixed up in. Okay, this is a very easy human fallacy to fall for. This thing that leads me into doing something wrong, does that mean that thing itself is wrong? No, it means you did something wrong. It's easier than to blame. I mean, that's what they did in the garden. You know, the man blamed the woman and he blamed God, essentially. The woman, of course, blamed the serpent. The serpent didn't get to speak when God questioned it, so I don't know what he would have blamed. So are we blaming something else for our failure? Are we blaming the law for our failure to uphold the law? Are we blaming the law for creating in us the desire to sin? Certainly not. Indeed, I would not have known what sin was except through the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, do not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by this commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. So once I was told not to covet, all of a sudden, I'm coveting everything. You know, and again, that happens. We've all experienced this. I am not going to believe anyone who tries to tell me they've never had this phenomenon occur within their consciences, within their soul. I'm not going to believe you. If you tell me that you've never experienced this, and that you are completely innocent of ever having this happen to you, I'm not going to believe you. I'm going to tell you to your face that you're a liar, because that's not true. Everybody knows it. Again, we know this even from kids. Kids are actually the most vulnerable to this. You can see this pattern play out clearly, because when you tell a kid not to do something, all of a sudden that kid is going to be more likely to do that. That's kind of why, in my view, negative reinforcements don't really work. Deterrence isn't really the way to get someone or something straightened out, because they're just going to have to learn that lesson on their own. Because I know that works for me. It's like I have to know this myself. I have to experience these negative consequences that come with doing these things myself. If you simply tell me not to do it, that's going to make me just want to do it even more. And so everybody has experienced that. That is a common human. I mean, it goes back to Eve in the garden, okay? There's not a human being alive or who has ever lived who has not experienced that. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. For apart from law, sin is dead. He said this a few different times now. As we said before, in 1 Corinthians 15, the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. The law gets its power, sin gets its power from the law. Because we know when we break the law, that's when we commit a sin. Our consciousness is raised, our awareness is raised to our sin, and we know what the law says. Once I was alive apart from law, but when the commandment came, by the way, before we continue, in this section, Paul seems to personify sin as a sort of conscious force. And I think, so he's kind of blending just the nature of sin itself. Okay, let's go back to James. I always go back to this because it gives us such a good overview of what, of the sinning process. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Now, something could get you to, there was a serpent in the garden who talked to Eve. Okay. Something could get your mind on that, but you're eventually going to be dragged away by your own evil desire. In the end, the serpent didn't make Eve eat the fruit. She looked at the tree and decided that it was pleasurable to eat after the serpent talked to her, but she made a decision on her own. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, which is the actual act. And sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. So here, he's talking about sin almost in a personified sense, as though it's like a conscious entity or embodiment. He's kind of blending sin with Satan, almost, here in Romans 7. Once I was alive apart from law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life, and I died. He's basically saying ignorance is bliss. Once I was happy and ignorant, not knowing what I was doing wrong. But once I became aware of what I was doing wrong, I died. I realized sin sprang to life, and I died. And the law could not help me in my dead state, because it was it did not afford a way for lawbreakers to be reconciled. It just pointed out what my sin was. I didn't know what my sin was before that. I was happy in bliss in my ignorance before I knew what my sins were. But once I became aware of the law, I became aware of my sin, and I can no longer claim ignorance is bliss any longer. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, again, kind of personifying sin as an intelligent force, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me. And through the commandment, put me to death. So then, the law is holy and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. So the law is good. We are simply unable to keep it. That doesn't mean the law is bad. It means that we can't keep it. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Again, he's going through this list of objections because he knows this is what the people who are listening to him are going to say. And these are objections that we all raise at some point because we always want to put the blame for our misbehavior on somebody else. This is a way for us to say, well, the law is bad. I couldn't keep the law. I was doomed. I was never going to be able to keep this law. I was never going to be able to avoid falling into sin. So the law is bad. Like, God should never have given me the law because it was never going to be, I never had a chance to keep it. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. But in order that sin, or evil, might be recognized as sin, it produced death in me through that which was good, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful. So we know what the problem is. All the way back in the garden, he put a tree in the garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he told man not to eat of that tree. I'm assuming he expected the man to tell his wife that after he made the woman and gave her to the man, which I guess he did. But they did eat of the tree. And then the serpent came along and said, well, you won't actually die if you eat of that tree. You'll become like God and you'll know the difference between good and evil. So the whole point is to know the difference between good and evil. We have to identify what this evil is. And in order to do that, we ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because we wanted to be like God and know the difference between good and evil. Well, we're going to find out. Okay, we have made the decision that we had to find this out the hard way, which is what this is all about, and it's what our experiences here on earth are all about. We made the decision way back when that we had to know the difference between good and evil, and we were going to have to find out the hard way. We are going to have to experience evil in order to know what is good. And that is essentially the story of humanity on earth. Now there will come a point in time as we grow, and even in our lives as we grow and mature, where we cast away what is evil and we embrace only what is good. And that's really what he's saying here in this whole passage, is that we have gone into the waters of baptism and come out a new creation, and our old self, the self that was cursed, that was part of the fleshly matter that was cursed upon the first sin back in Genesis 3, that soul self has been done away with, and we are walking in newness of life with a new husband, a new master, with a new nature, slaves to righteousness, husband to Christ, and free now from the old self and able to live empowered by the Spirit to bear fruits of the Spirit. But in order to reach this level of maturity, we had to know what evil and sin really was and say no to it and put it behind us, which we couldn't do on our own. That's which he's going to go into in depth here in the next section. By our own power, we could not do this. By our own power, even if we knew the difference between good and evil, which we can know the difference because of the law, but even still, by our own power, we could not actually live for good and not evil, and which he's going to go into in excessive detail here in the rest of chapter 7.